Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson and Dr. Jonathan Cook. Today we're going to be talking about Conrad's Victory. This is quite a surprising text for myself. Dr. Jonathan Cook selected it for us. And it was surprising to me on a number of levels. I'm not that familiar with Conrad, and I'm finding myself entranced and really getting into his writing. It's hard for me to believe that English is not his first language, and he's writing so well. So, that's kind of shocking whenever you see a foreigner writing better than most
Yeah.
Americans. And then, second of all, I don't, Dr. Cook, we haven't discussed this at all, but what I was doing to reinforce and prepare for our discussion is I was like, did they make this into a movie? And you know what? They did.
They
And
did, yeah.
they did.
Several times. Yeah.
They made it a couple times. I found the 1996 version with Willem
Yeah.
Dafoe.
Yeah.
And, you know, my expectations were kind of low. I'm not a big Willem Dafoe head.
Yeah.
I was not expecting a great movie or a very faithful rendition of the
Yeah.
text. But at least in my opinion, it was a good movie
Yeah.
and didn't stray too much from the text. I thought generally it kind of communicated what the text was trying to communicate. You may disagree.
Yeah. I have not seen it. I need to see it, but
Oh, okay. Well,
but
I would recommend it. I would
yeah.
recommend it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I definitely want to see it. There were other they made a silent version in 1919 and
Right.
then a sound version in 1930 and then 1940. So it hasn't been neglected by filmmakers.
Well, it's the
Um,
first I heard of it. Have you seen any of the other
but
versions?
no.
No. Well,
Um, you know, I'm always wary about the disappointment, but I definitely will see I think it was 1995, Willem Dafoe. I don't know who the director was, but um, it seemed like with some good actors like that, it would be they would have to do a decent job.
I found it to be compelling.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, so
So, yeah, what can we get some background on this text? Or when was
yeah,
it written?
yeah. Okay, so Victory. It's often considered Conrad's last important novel. I mean, after he kept writing until his death in 1924. This book was published in 1915, in the middle of World War One, and the title "Victory" for readers, they automatically thought that it had something to do with World War One, but of course it did not. He finished the book before the start of the war, and so anyway, we'll talk more about that later. But so he started it in October 1912, finished it in May 1914. So on and off, took him about a year and a half. But he actually began the book and then realized he had two stories to tell. One he published as a short story called "Because of the Dollars." It's in a short story publication called "Within the Tides," which has four sort of long stories. They're almost novellas. And then the other half turned into Victory. Both of them take place in the Far East, involving some ne'er-do-wells who are trying to steal some money from an innocent man. But in the case of Because of the Dollars, the guy actually does have the money on his boat. He's collecting money from different trading stations in Indonesia, and as he goes his rounds, a small group of displaced Europeans are there to try to steal the money from him, steal off his boat, to ambush him at night and take the money. And the wife of one of the conspirators tips off the captain, and he's ready for them, and they never get the money. But she dies because one of the guys realizes they've been betrayed. But so anyway, you have a kind of rough parallels between the two stories, but Victory is the much longer story, and it came out after Within the Tides, that collection. So Victory, he had Conrad's great run of novels was in the first decade of the 20th century. Lord Jim, 1900, then Nostromo, 1904, Secret Agent, 1907, Under Western Eyes, 1910. I mean, those are considered his big books. Victory is, I think it's not quite up to the level of the earlier ones, but certainly a major work. And then his later works are great adventure stories, but they're not as philosophically rewarding. Books like The Shadow Line or The Rover was a late book.
I'm telling you,
Arrow of Gold.
I want to do Heart of Darkness with you at some point.
Heart of Darkness, yeah, that's earlier. That's 1899. So you could consider, maybe his great works began in the last couple of years of the 19th century. But so people who read Conrad, sometimes they stop with the big four or five. I mean, if you read them in college, you read Heart of Darkness because it's short and teachable, and but his books, are always great adventure stories. It's just when he's really investing himself in the stories, there's all kinds of interesting artistic questions of point of view and chronology and philosophical depth rather than interesting plotting. So I think Victory has all of the requirements to be, one of his great works. It's got the philosophy, it's got the great characterizations, some great villains, and some complexity that makes it valuable. So anyway, it's a book that you really have to be a sort of a Conrad fan to have read it, and not just a casual reader.
Well, yeah, you definitely put it on my radar. I have to say I quite enjoyed it. I mean, there's the constant philosophical discussion about sin and so I think there's a passing treatment of that I think would make for interesting explication. But for me, even before I can get to some of the philosophical concepts in it, there was some kind of, and maybe this ties in with the autobiographical elements to it. There were a few plot points that, like, and I don't know if I want to spoil it for anybody, but there are a few plot points that, like, I read it kind of quickly. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
That were kind of ambiguous for me, and maybe they're intentionally ambiguous, like, and maybe there's an autobiographical dimension here to me, or that you could reveal or something like that. But like the nature of the woman that, like, the secretary, is it Rodrigo or Ricardo. I'm sorry. I was computer stuff.
Yeah, Elena.
I can't tell if she had some sort of longer machination in order for survival, or if there was some moment of considered infidelity with this.
No, I think she realized that this would be a way to save the life of Axel Heist by taming this beast and pretending that she was going along with him. So I think she thought that she could get things under control by dealing with him in her own way. But I don't think there was no possibility of her being interested in this, savage character. And, the fact that Heist even thinks that when he sees them together is just some kind of male reflex action. But I think it just shows he is still kind of clueless about how devoted she is to him, because he's really kind of an emotional innocent. He has, it's hard for him to make connections with people.
Yeah, he says many times he's never loved before.
Yeah, I mean, he grew up, his mother died. He grew up with a philosopher father who wrote books about, how horrible life was. I consider him kind of an heir of Schopenhauer, a sense of the world as an immense realm of suffering. So, and there was a huge Schopenhauerian influence in the late 19th century in England, France, Germany. French writers just ate it up, like Maupassant, Flaubert, and so this guy has grown up sort of emotionally deprived because his father is telling him to disengage and just be silent, just listen in on the world. Don't get involved because you're just going to get hurt.
Well, that raises an interesting question. You bring the father to our attention. We're getting to some of the specifics, and maybe we need the 40,000-foot perspective, but it was puzzling to me how much attention was brought to the portrait of his father.
Yeah.
And maybe at some point, and maybe this ties into the autobiographical dimension too. I don't know, like what that portrait is an obvious symbol, but it was a little bit mysterious to me why we're being constantly reminded of it.
He's kind of the presiding genius of San Baran, the island he's on. This is the ideal that his father created. Disengage from life. Don't get involved. Just listen in. So it's almost like he's the presiding deity or genius of the island there, where he's gone, where he thinks no one can find him because he's so off the beaten track. And I think, if you look at Conrad's life, his father, of course, died died of tuberculosis as a Polish intellectual leader of the liberation of Poland from, it's the fact that it didn't exist as a country throughout the 19th century. It was partitioned by Austria, Prussia, and Russia. And Conrad's father was part of the movement to try to restore the country. And Conrad, fled Poland as a teenager because he didn't want to get involved in the misery of trying to lead a revolutionary movement where, it was guaranteed to fail, but you were still going to do something heroic. You were still going to show your loyalty to the people of Poland, So Conrad, I think, felt this immense guilt by leaving Poland in the mid-1870s to go to sea. He shipped out as a on French vessels at first in the Mediterranean, and then went over to the English Merchant Marine in 1921. I'm sorry. At the age of 21 is what I'm trying to say. 1878, roughly. So I think the idea of disengagement is something that Conrad himself felt deeply because he left his country of origin to explore the world and to have a life and to be a writer. And his father was a huge influence on his life. He was a literary figure, translator, and I think there's some of that element of the presiding genius of the father looking over the son's shoulder while he writes, judging him.
Are there other autobiographical aspects of the novel that we should be aware about?
Well, only that Conrad, himself knew East Asia pretty well. He was constantly going on ships, English Merchant Marine, going through to Australia, Singapore, Indonesia, and he had lots of experience at all levels of the Merchant Marine. He ended up as a captain on one ship for one voyage. But in the author's note in the 1920 edition, he also talks about the biographical models of some of the characters that he in the book that he picked up throughout his life. He doesn't localize them all the time, but he talks about the model for Jones, the gambler that he observed when he was in the Caribbean. Ricardo was another guy he met when he was in the Gulf of Mexico on a ship. And Lena was a French musician that he saw in a cafe who was part of a traveling orchestra, who was pinched on the arm just like Lena was by kind of a brutal head of the little orchestra that she played in. So Conrad, he uses models that he picks out throughout life, and some of them we know well, some of them we don't know. We don't know most of the other ones that he mentions here. So anyway,
so what about this text fitting in with his concepts of fidelity and solidarity?
Fidelity, yeah. You think of Conrad, you think of being faithful to your job, to your duty, to your people, your community, and this is, I think, it shows that he's illustrating what happens when you divorce yourself from that goal. So Heist follows his father's lead and isolates himself on this island in the Indonesian archipelago, and he twice helps people with their lives. I mean, he helps his friend Morrison by paying his fine to the Portuguese port authority so he doesn't lose his ship. Then he gets involved in running a coal company on the island of San Baran where he's living, and that goes bankrupt. So he's there basically just hanging out after the end of that business. Then he helps out this young woman who's oppressively participating in this orchestra, this all-female orchestra in Surabaya in Java, in a hotel run by this German Schomburg, who's a really interesting character. I mean, a great villain because he's just so believable. This big bearded German guy whose wife is kind of afraid of him, and that he, basically dominates, and just how he himself wanted to make a move on Lena, when she was playing in the orchestra in his pavilion, and he felt like he was cheated by Heist, who rescued her from the misery of playing in this all-women's orchestra with this abusive woman, who pinches her for not doing what she wants.
In the movie, they make it a little bit more salacious with this orchestra.
Oh, really?
So it's like traveling orchestra / brothels, like the.
Well, there's a little hint of that in the novel because the orchestra leader says, the woman says, go mix with the customers, and hang out with them. And so it's obvious that some of them might have little liaisons with men, but it's kind of a farcical scene.
Yeah.
Where Heist is listening to them, and it's the description of the music is like, it sounds like chaos, and the orchestra leader's wife is there at the piano, and I love the description of her because she's got these, flaring, angry nostrils as she pounds the piano, and you can just see this Italian couple trying to lead these young women through some popular tunes of, I don't know, what they play, maybe some Strauss or Lehar, or some of the popular music from the late 19th, early 20th century. So that the world of this book it's some of it it's great because Conrad has such a brilliant sense of irony, and some of the descriptions are just funny, but they're also so grotesque and grim and horrific. like the three villains in the book are just, they're laughable in how horrible they are, but they're just so believable
Yeah, they're
as characters. So anyway, the idea is that, heist disengages and reality comes and bites him in the ass. Like you can never get away.
fate will
There's no
find you.
refuge.
The world will pay you a visit.
Yeah, it will find you.
Yeah. So, is there any? Where did this character Alex Heist come from? I was when I was reading, I was like, do we have a pun going on here? Do we have a play on
Well,
words?
Christ, heist.
Oh, so he's like a Christ figure, Heist Christ.
Yeah, and Axel. Axel was the name of a literary character in a play by Villiers de l'Isle d'Adam. He was a well-known play from the later 19th century where he's playing an aristocrat who is involved in this love affair, and then there's a famous line in the play where Axel, they commit suicide. He and his girlfriend commit suicide at the end, and his line is, as for living, the servants will do that for us. In other words, living is a miserable thing. It's better to just make your exit, now. So there is, I think, the element that I think definitely borrowed that name from that play. And heist, of course, rhymes with Christ. He is unavoidably a Christ figure because of all the evil that is done to him when all he does is good. The grotesque disparity between his good actions and the evil that people think of him, specifically Schaumburg and the three villains.
Yeah, I wondered if there was like some connection to like a heist, like a
Heist, like pulling off a heist.
Yeah, because there's rumors
yeah.
about
Ironic pun because he's not the one. It's the other people who wanted to pull off the heist.
Right. But I'm saying there are these rumors about how he treated his business partner Morrison.
Right.
So
he killed them and stole money. Yeah.
I didn't know if that's was to muddy the water.
I think that's a valid inference from the name. Yeah.
Well, outside of the illusions, I mean, where else is Alex Heist based on anyone?
I think Conrad is just putting a little of himself in there.
Yeah.
As a son. This is a Swedish baron.
Right.
Living in London. Conrad's father was part of the aristocracy. There was, 10% of the country belonged to this category of aristocracy, and he belonged to that upper crust. So you could see that Conrad is sort of imagining Axel Heist as a surrogate for himself. Of course, his father died when he was 11, and he was partly raised by his mother's brother, his uncle in Ukraine. And he didn't have a legacy. I mean, he had to go to sea as a teenager because the family had no money to support him, really, or very little money.
So, if someone were to ask you whether or not this is a love story, what do you say?
Well, I'm just curious. I mean, it's not clear. I mean, Lena clearly loves this guy, although it takes her a while to sort of get used to him. And he kind of is devoted to her, but this is not like a steamy romance or anything. What was your impression? You think they must have had a little sexual encounter, but it's almost as though he's got to, completely reconfigure his emotions to be really in love with her. I mean, he's just sort of, devoted to her, but not really that passionate.
Well, the movie kind of.
Movie will make it into
the movie. The way that it goes in the movie is like that. It's kind of like the vibe that it gets is like he's saving her. and then they like gradually develop into a romantic relationship because they're the only ones on the island, you know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
and she's super attractive in the film,
Yeah.
this French violinist. So it
Yeah.
makes it kind of easy for her to become. I think, but taking that all aside, I mean, a big part of the story is about his desire to protect her,
Yeah.
right, and that he never had to think about anyone before
Yeah.
himself, and so his, like you said, his priorities get shuffled, where he is, you know, deeply preoccupied about being disarmed, about trying to find weapons to protect her from these
Yeah.
men that show up on his island. So,
Yeah.
would I call this a romance, like a romance novel or something like that? No, but I think I think it's a subplot to it. I don't know what would you call this? I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Um,
it's not like you know, it's not like we're on the high seas exploring. Yet there's like elements of, you know, castaways or a ship, like a, you know, people becoming stranded and nursed back to health that we see in other like explore.
about the love affair and how sort of ambiguous it is. I mean, there's no real sex scenes in the novel, but I mean, I think they clearly are involved physically, but he's kind of learning how to love someone because he's spent, you know, he's what, in his mid-30s. He hasn't really had any close relationships in most of his life.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's the closest thing we're gonna a heist is gonna get to a love story. It sounds like to me, and I don't know about enough of the relationships that go on in Conrad's life if this mirrors his
Well,
own romantic development in any way.
he, you know, people criticized him. He did not have an experience of great loves in his life. I mean, he married a sort of lower class woman who was a very good housekeeper, but not at all on his intellectual level, Jessie. And but I think, you know, he's good at showing male infatuation with, you know, idealized women.
Sure.
Um, you know, like in Under Western Eyes, Razumov, you know, is in love with, you know, Holden's sister, and she's this noble young woman, and he's just so in love with her. But of course, you know, he was responsible for having her brother executed by, you know, turning him in. So anyway, it's a she's quite an interesting character. I was reading that she's, you know, she shares some elements from an Anatole France novel of a character from a novel called The Red Lily, someone named Therese, a young woman who, I mean, in her situation, she was kind of on the brink of sort of selling herself to some man because of her poverty, you know, sort of on the edge of prostitution because of her position in life, you know, no family to support her, traveling around with a female band in East Asia, you know, with an abusive orchestra leader and his wife. So anyway, one of the other things I wanted to mention is the literary influences in the book, because of course the one that stands out perhaps most for people is the Tempest, you know, Prospero on his island,
Yeah.
who is, you know, a party comes from, you know, he's been living in exile on this island because his brother usurped power, and he's there with his daughter Miranda, and these ne'er do wells from Milan show up because of a shipwreck, and he has to kind of subdue them. And his servant is Ariel, you know, who's this kind of character who appears and disappears at times. And it's interesting that the character Wang, the Chinese servant, is
Yeah.
is notably kind of mysterious about appearing out of nowhere and then disappearing. So he's kind of the aerial character. And of course, the Caliban character is Pedro, who is part of the threesome who show up to, rob his money, his imaginary money. And Jones and Ricardo are, some of the invading characters from Milan who are sort of condescending about Prospero. I mean, they're not trying to kill him. Well, actually, they are plotting against him, but they are fooled by Ariel, who messes up their plot. And then Miranda, of course, the innocent young woman, is very rough equivalent to Lena. So yeah, there's Conrad read Shakespeare originally when he was in Poland as a young man, as a teenager, and Shakespeare was one of his great loves literarily. Some of the other interesting literary models are Chaucer's Partner's Tale. Conrad read Chaucer, and the Partner's Tale is about these three ne'er-do-wells who are hanging out in a tavern. It's told by the partner, who's one of the most corrupt character of the Canterbury characters, and he has a kind of ambiguous sexuality. He's kind of unhealthy looking. He's got stringy blonde hair, and he could be roughly equivalent to the character Jones, because it's kind of implied that he's sort of asexual or gay. But anyway, his tale is about, he's trying to, the partner tells the story so he can entertain the other Canterbury pilgrims and maybe get some money out of them as a reward for his storytelling. So he tells the story about these three ne'er-do-wells hanging out in a tavern, and they hear that someone has died because it's the plague. And they say, well, we're going to go out and kill Death. They're all drunk. They say, that was our friend, that guy. So we're going to go out and kill Death because he killed our friend. So they go out, and they're looking around, and they meet this old man, and they say, we're looking for Death. Do you know where he is? And this old man, he's kind of this mysterious character. You think maybe he's like a figure of death. He's like, but he can't die. That's his problem. At least he says so. So he's sort of the wandering Jew of that literary tradition. And he tells him to go find Death under a tree. So they go under the tree, and there's a big bag of gold. And two of the guys sit down and say, hey, you go into town. The younger one goes into town to buy some bread and wine for us, because we can't carry off this gold until it's dark. So the young guy goes in town. Meanwhile, the two guys who were there are plotting, saying, we don't want this guy because we're going to have to share the gold three ways. We'll get rid of him. There's only two to share it. The guy in town getting the wine and bread gets some rat poison and puts it in the wine. So he goes, gives the wine and bread to the other two guys, but before they do anything, they run behind and stab him to death. Then they drink the wine, and they both die of poisoning. So then the partner says, that's my moral, folks. Radix malorum cupiditas. The root of all evil is greed, which is pretty apt for the book in the characters in Victory, because the three guys are looking for this imaginary gold that Heist has. And there's actually one reference to the idea of it being looking under a tree. Maybe they've hidden it under a tree, Maybe Axel has hidden it there. And they end up all, killing each other. Although, as Wang kills Pedro when he finds him in the boat, but Jones kills Ricardo. And then Jones either falls off or jumps into the water when he sees the boat gone. So the death of all these ne'er-do-wells, parallels the Chaucer story. But it just shows the versatility of Conrad's imagination, that he can draw in another, literary tradition. He also uses a myth of Acus and Galatea and Polyphemus,
Oh,
which is pretty impressive. It's a story told in Ovid's Metamorphoses about
it's probably
Shepherd
famous
Acus,
the Cyclops.
the Cyclops from the Odyssey. Well, this Cyclops ended up as a character in some pastoral poetry in the ancient world. So here, the Cyclops is in love with Galatea, who's who's a water nymph.
Right.
She's in love with Acus the shepherd. The Polyphemus is jealous. Well, he has a long poem about a song where he tells about how much he loves this young nymph, and he's going to woo her, and he has a rival. Well, he ends up killing Acus, but of course Galatea is repulsed by him, so he does not end up with anything. So it's kind of interesting that there's a rough parallel there to Ricardo, who's the guy who thinks that Lena is going to be in love with him because he's so smitten with her, when all she wants to do is kill him. And of course, Lena's love interest, Axel, dies of his own volition, suicide. But still, it's interesting, the parallels there of that story. And then, of course, the title of victory comes from St. Paul's 1 Corinthians 15, where there's a great hymn to religious faith, and the idea is, faith in Christ is going to overcome death, and the famous phrase is, "O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory?" So the idea is, death is not the end. Well, it's good for Lena. I mean, she thinks that she's dying to save her the guy who rescued her, Axel, but the title can only be considered ironic in that Axel, faces the horror of seeing this woman that he was trying to save, accidentally killed, and he himself feels responsible for that. So, and also the fact that it was published in 1915 made it ironic too, in that there was no indication of victory on the Western Front at that point for anyone, for the English or French. So, as in all great literature, there's lots of interesting sources and influences of other works that you find in the book that you wouldn't really notice unless you were well read. I mean, you probably noticed the Tempest. You probably wouldn't think of the Pardoner's Tale unless you were pretty attuned to Chaucer's work.
Well, do you think if Conrad is amalgamating all these different influences, presumably he's not just doing some sort of literature collage. He has some sort of point he's trying to get across.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Like I'm working on a book right now. I mean, it's not just an aesthetic project. There's a message that, though unclear to myself right now, I think that I want to communicate. And I would imagine, unless Conrad was trying to pay some bills with this book, that there's something he wanted to say. And if we could say, what is that thing that he wants to say? Or am I wrong? Is this just a work of art?
I think he wants, all these influences are filtering through his creative mind as he's writing, and only having to do with the theme of isolation and connection with other human beings, and temptation and greed and love.
So you don't necessarily think that he has a monolithic message he's trying to communicate, but he's interested in exploring all these things and sifting through these other allusions to to mythology and Shakespeare and Chaucer
Yeah,
in an effort to explore those ideas. It's an exploration,
yeah,
not so much a communication.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, his big theme is solidarity, but it's also about the fact that reality is just unknowable. The skeptical view of the world, like we don't know anything. Our impressions are all we know, and that's all we can talk about. He's often considered a literary impressionist because of his focus on entire perceptions of the world that we can't really assume is reality. Um, and that's his great message to the world. I think as a writer, he's a skeptical view of everything, of religion, of imperialism, character, whatever.
We've spoken some about how this fits into his
His other work,
his other
yeah.
works. Have we exhausted that subject?
Well, you could make some parallels. I mean, the classic stories about isolated Westerners living in Asia or Africa, and how it drives them crazy or makes them fall in love. And I mean, there's a um, um, you know the Planter of Malata is a book that's in Within the Tides, written a little bit before this story, about a guy who's an Englishman who's living as the agent and scientist on a plantation raising silkworms, and he goes into, I think, a place that I think it's Singapore, where he falls in love with this woman who's looking for her ex, uh, her fiance, who has run away because he's involved with some kind of financial scandal, and so he falls hopelessly in love with this woman, and is destroyed by the fact that he can't have her, even though he had hired her ex fiance, but the guy had died, and he couldn't tell her that. Um, and so anyway, similar element there. Under Western Eyes, Razumov is also a guy who has this horrible evil thrust on him when this revolutionary barges in on his apartment after blowing up a minister with a bomb, and is forced to engage with life even though he didn't want to. All he wanted to do was get his university degree and become a professor. Um, and yeah, so you have elements. The Far Eastern themes are present in some of his earlier work. In his first novel, Aylmer's Folly and The Outcast of the Island, take place in Malaysia. Um, so yeah, I mean, consistent themes throughout his work. Under Western Eyes, you could see that as the most recent important novel he wrote. So obviously some carryover themes about being thrust into the world, um, and having no options, no right answers to the dilemma that you're going to be put in. Hobson's choice, both of them bad.
So perhaps just because we're a little short on tape today,
Yeah,
if we could round out our discussion, perhaps talking about how this was received at the time,
yeah,
critically, popularly, and
yeah. Well, the
the
irony
case
is,
and the case for why people ought to be reading it today.
yeah, the irony is that Conrad just started to become popular when it was some of the critics thought that his powers were waning. After 1915, he never wrote a book that had the standing of some of his early work. So Victory is kind of on the cusp of that. But it did get some criticism, but it was popular because it had the love story appealed to readers, and he he started to make money on his books after about 1915, and he had a collected edition of his work put out by Doubleday in 1920. He found a guy who started buying up his manuscripts, an American lawyer, and got money that way. So it was kind of the turning point of his career. He had been poor and in debt for a long time. He also had a lot of physical ailments. He had terrible gout that would affect him, and he had some rheumatism. So he was sick a lot. It's amazing that he wrote as much as he did, because he had these breakdowns between and during his writing. So the book, it's gotten enough attention that they made movies out of it. Today, I think people should read it. Partly, with the Me Too movement, it's got a great villain there, Schomburg, who was hoping to make Lena his mistress, and then in revenge sends these three villains to find imaginary treasure on Axel Heist's island as punishment. So he's kind of abusive to his wife. I mean, very, probably physically abusive to her. So some great villains to read about, and it's a great parable of good and evil, and the powerlessness of good sometimes, if it's not attentive to what happens when good people are not attuned to how precarious goodness in the world is. It's kind of a wake up call for us today about the peril of goodness in the world as we wait for Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine and our voting rights to be eroded more and more in this country. Anyway, that's a couple of reasons to read it today.
Well, I think those are fine reasons. Well, yeah. I have some creative editing ahead of me to.
Okay, so I'll turn this off.
Yeah, but thank you, Dr. Cook, and we'll find a new text to address next time.
Okay.
Thanks.